Welcome. This is our live DataGraph webinar. My name is Pamela Schultz, and today we're going to be talking about great looking graphs for presentations. I've been seeing a lot of calls for in-person meetings, which is really a nice thing to see, and I thought that this would be a good topic for one of our webinars. So what I've been doing this week is actually been spending a bit of time using a number of different tools and testing out what happens when I bring the graphs from DataGraph into those different tools and how to really make them look their best. You're spending a lot of time making your graphs. If you're going to present them, you certainly want them to look as good as you can. So first, what I wanted to do is share with you the tools that I've been playing around with this week and just briefly introduce them in case some of these are not something you're familiar with. There's really 4 different presentation software tools that I used this week. The first one is Keynote, which is the tool that comes with the macOS operating system. I used version 12.1 for the test that I did, and we'll certainly show you a bunch of stuff in Keynote. Hang on. Okay, here we go. There we go. The next tool that I used was a version of PowerPoint, but I used the web version of PowerPoint. So be aware of the fact that this may be slightly different than the downloaded version of PowerPoint. I thought this would be sort of interesting, actually, to kind of compare using a web tool versus using Keynote, which is downloaded onto my computer. I also wanted to try Google Slides. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And the last tool that I used was a tool called Beamer. And if you're not, I just got a note that I lost the live connection. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. Anyone on the chat who wants to give a shout out, please let me know. Hopefully my live tool is working properly as far as I can see. As far as I can see, it is. So the last tool, in case this got cut off, was Beamer. And this is, for any of you who are not familiar with this is a very different type of tool for creating presentations. And I got on the chat that you can hear me. Excellent. Beamer is actually a tool that is part of LaTeX. LaTeX is a text-based language where this is a LaTeX file over here. I'm actually using a program called Overleaf. This is an online version, but the presentations you make within using the Beamer package, this is an example here of something that I was playing with. If you're not familiar with LaTeX, this is a typesetting language that's very popular in engineering and math. It's really great for doing mathematical equations, which is why it's particularly popular in those fields. I've used LaTeX a lot and have found it to be kind of a great tool for doing documents and doing presentations. So that's why I wanted to include it here. But it is very different. So what I want to do first is actually, let me go back to the Keynote slides that I put together. And I wanted to talk about today really 3 rules that I kind of came up with to divide up the topics that I wanted to present. And the first rule that I would say for making good-looking graphs in presentation is to always use vector graphics. What is a vector graphic? Well, it's a graphic type that if you scale it, you're not going to lose any, it's still going to look nice and crisp and clear. You're not losing information when you scale. Here's an example of, well, maybe I should start here. Here's a Venn diagram. This is actually a pretty recent example file that we have within DataGraph. And you can see these 3 different images. These are actually all created in DataGraph and at different sizes. But when I scale them up to be consistent size within Keynote, they all look great in terms of there's no fuzziness. These are essentially PDF versions of this graphic that are being imported into Keynote, and I will show you how to do that. Let me just actually show you, I guess the other part of this rule, rule 1, always use vector graphics. The other part of the rule is that if you can't use a vector graphic, make sure you have enough DPI, dots per inch, that you're using for your image. And to show you that, for example, let's go over here to my Google Slides. This shows you an example of the same 3 images brought into Google Slides, which does not have the ability to use a vector graphic. And you can see how the first one here, when blown up to a size, looks pretty bad quality. But over here on the right-hand side, this looks much better and has a lot more DPI. So I'll show you how to set that up. Okay, rule 2, let me go back over to my Keynote here. Rule 2 is to use consistent scaling. And here's an example of 3 graphs that are brought from DataGraph into this Keynote file. And they don't look horrible, but if you do look closely at this, what you'll see is that the font sizes are all a little bit different. You can see that for example, the legends are different sizes. These aren't really lining up here along the sides. But if we use consistent scaling, we can get our graphics to look more like this, where now everything has the same font size. Things are scaled really consistently. I think this looks really nice. And this in particular is something I think that DataGraph does a nice job at helping you to create graphics like this. The other thing, rule 3, this is the last one that we'll really talk about, is to use transparencies properly. And just for example, this is an image, again, pasted in from DataGraph, and when you bring it into Keynote with a background, it actually does give you a transparent image, but because I had my font is black and my legend here is not transparent, so it really doesn't look great. But I'll give you some tips for making this a lot easier and understanding how to properly bring in a graphic like you see here, where now I have my fonts and my lines are all an appropriate color, and my background for my legend is not there. Okay, so the first thing, or the first rule, again, is use vector graphics. And what I wanted to do actually is just show you, to start, how do I get an image from DataGraph into Keynote? What is the easiest way to do that? So if I go over to DataGraph, and I have some other things that I want to show you here, but let me go ahead and pull up the example files, and we'll use the Venn, here we go, this Venn diagram example. I'll go ahead and open up this file, and you can see there's an image here. This is the one that I want to bring in. So it's very easy to get this from DataGraph into a program like Keynote. All I need to do is right-click on the image itself. You'll find that there is a copy option, and you see these options here for copying the figure. Now, what I always do typically is just use the first option, copy figure. You also can tell it specifically only copy a PDF or copy a bitmap. Now, why would you need that? Well, basically what happens when you select copy figure is DataGraph places into your clipboard a version of the image that is both a PDF and a bitmap, PNG, for example. And then it will paste into the program you're using the most appropriate version. Basically, if the program can handle a PDF, it'll take a PDF. So that's why I usually just default to copy figure. So if I go ahead and do that and then go back into Keynote, and now I'm just going to paste that in, there is my image. So it's just as easy as that. And if I needed to scale it, you can see I can scale it here. Again, I'm not going to lose any quality in the image, but I might be changing things like the font size and the line size. So the other part, I guess, of this first rule in terms of using the vector graphics is that if you can't use a vector graphic, then you'll want to make sure that you're using an image that has a suitable amount of DPI, that it's a big enough image that it's not going to give you those blurry edges. So how do I do that in DataGraph? Well, if I want to export this, and so for both PowerPoint, on the PowerPoint web version and Google Sheets web version, they do not accept PDFs or vector graphics. So you'll have to export a file from DataGraph and then import that file into either of those tools if those are the tools that you're going to use. Beamer actually will take PDFs and EPS files is another type of vector graphic. But for the Google and the PowerPoint Online, they won't use PDF, so you're going to have to export an image. Okay, so how do I export an actual image from here and make sure that the quality is going to be good enough? You can go to the export, but one thing we added is this gear menu. This is, if you're using an older version of DataGraph, you might not see this, but if you click this gear menu, there is an export option directly for that image. And then you get, I'll go ahead and go over to my temp directory. Then you get an option of, this is my new one that I'm going to export. And the format options are down below. Now notice if you select PDF, then you don't have to select anything else. You don't have to select the quality because it is a vector graphic. There's you're not going to have to say what the DPI is. But if I'm going to select any of these types that are not vector graphics, so a PNG, a TIFF, a JPEG, those are all in the category of bitmap-based, pixel-based images. If I select a PNG, now it's going to ask me or give me an option of specifying a resolution. By default, what we do is we have the resolution set to 144 DPI. This is the Retina resolution within DataGraph. Now, you don't have to stick with that. You can go ahead and say, 300 DPI, for example. That would be a pretty high value. And if you're bringing this image into, again, the PowerPoint or the or Google Sheets, then that's going to give you likely a pretty good looking image. So I could go ahead and do that. Now, if I go to, let's see, I wanted to show you the temp directory. So here's this directory where I brought these images out to. And one kind of handy trick is to, if you go to an image and do, let's see, I believe this is Command I, then that brings up the information about that image. So here's the image that I just saved. And what you'll notice is that it will tell me the dimensions of this image, 250 by 250. And this is a combination of the size I set within DataGraph, or the size it was in DataGraph, and the DPI that I chose. So if I choose a lower DPI, then the number of pixels here is going to be less. And I actually did 3 different versions of this earlier where I set the exact sizing and then output the DPI. So let me actually just make sure you are familiar with how do you set the size within DataGraph, because this is such a key part of this. So you'll notice how right here is the size menu. This is in our canvas settings. This image, for example, is set to a 600 by 600. So when I output it, it is, because it's 144, it's actually going to be bigger than that. I had this long discussion this week with David about the differences between points and pixels and DPI, and it can be a little bit confusing, but 72 DPI, or dots per inch, was the original screen resolution for Apple computers. The Retina resolution is 144 DPI, but when you're projecting something onto a big screen, there may be a much higher resolution available, which again is why, if you're having to output a file, then just make sure you're using an appropriate DPI. Okay, so let me go ahead and just go over to, actually, I did want to show you, if I go back to the files that I exported, and this is kind of an interesting experiment to do. These are now set to different pixel sizes. So I did the Venn diagram at 100 by 100, 144 DPI. So again, if I do Command I, then I can get information about this. And what you'll see is how the dimensions here are double the 100 by 100 because of the DPI being at Retina resolution. It's actually twice the number of pixels as what you set within DataGraph. Again, you don't necessarily need to get too caught up in that, but I think it's important to recognize how, if you're going to look at this, how this number corresponds to what you output within DataGraph. And if we go then to, let me go ahead and close this, and let's go over to PowerPoint, for example. So here is where I imported the same diagram at the 100 by 100, 150 by 150, and 300 by 300. So you can see that the sizes are different. And yet one of the things that PowerPoint, again, the web version, does is when I imported a file, inserted an image, it seemed to limit the height to a 3-inch size. Now, how do I know that? Well, anytime I import an image, which, first of all, maybe I should just show you quickly how that is done. So if I go to New Slide, I'm just going to add a blank slide, and I insert a picture, and I'm doing this from this device, and then I can pick, again, the one that I have here. Actually, maybe I'll do the new one that I just did, and then it's going to import this image. But when the picture gets imported, if you then click on this button right here, what you see is, oh, that's not the one I wanted, right here, the width and the height of the image. So it actually will tell you how this is now scaling it to and this mine is set here in inches, to the width and the height of this image. And again, I can make this bigger, and then this is going to change. But this is slightly different than in, if we want to go back to Keynote, when I look at this image, I have this set to using points. So this is showing me this image is 600 by 600 points. And each program is a little bit different in terms of how it allows you to scale the sizes. Anyway, let me see. I see that there is a question. Yeah, I don't know if I exactly. Yeah, the size of the file is not necessarily a huge concern. So I think using a larger DPI is fine. Though I will say, if you go too high, then because these are online tools, then you might slow down your presentation because of that. But this is one of the advantages also of Rule 1, use vector graphics if you can, because then you're able to use a file size that's much smaller. So the vector graphics not only look better, but they're also smaller file sizes. And okay, so anyway, so you can see how we can bring in a file into PowerPoint. We can rescale it, but let's go ahead and move on to the next rule that I have, which is to use consistent scaling and to give you some information and tips on how to do that within DataGraph. Let's go back to, therefore, my window here where I have DataGraph. And I have 3 example files that I want to use for this. These are all examples that are in the online example files. So if you go to the online examples, and I think these are all also in the basic, we're going to use the first one here, line plots by year, the area graph, and also the multicolor line plots. So I've already opened those files and downloaded them. And what I want to do is to start with, let's go back to my Keynote here. And let's add in a slide that already has these images in it. And if I want to place an image into my Keynote presentation, again, I can always paste them in and rescale them, but there's a lot of benefit to properly sizing them in DataGraph so that when you do copy and paste them in, they're going to be just the way that you like them, and you're not going to have to mess around with them in Keynote. If you're anything like me, when you make a graph, you don't always make it once, you make it multiple times. So having it just paste in and not having to resize every time you paste it, I find to be a big benefit. So here is this image, for example, that I want to place an image into. And I showed you earlier what it would look like if I just pasted these 3 graphics in that I'm going to use without pre-sizing them within DataGraph with different sizes and different fonts. So to do this properly, to get this look is what I'm going to show you right now. So here's what I started with to create that, where they have these images. And if you click on an image, what you'll see is the width and height in pixels for that exact image. If I go then into DataGraph, so this is 585 by 426, I can go to my image here, we'll just start with this one, and type in 585 by 426. Let's see, did I do that right? Yep, 585 by 426. And then the other thing that I want you to notice is this option here for zoom. You can see how in my Keynote file this says 50%. Well, in DataGraph, there is also a zoom setting that's right next to the setting for the size of the graph, that if I set that to 50%, what you see now within your DataGraph file is exactly what this would look like if I paste it into here. So what I'll notice, point out to you, what often happens is that when you scale up this appropriate size that you need for a file when you're in Keynote, same thing with the sizes for PowerPoint or Google, you'll tend to want to increase things like your font to look appropriate when you to you know, be an appropriate size. So say if I want this to be 20-point font, for example, maybe I also want to, I happen to know I'm going to want to have a Y label here. Let's just call this data to be easy enough. Another thing that you'll probably want to change for something like this is the distance here that you have on the Y-axis. You can do that within the axis settings. This is called the space for Y, which is currently set to medium. We can just make this a narrow setting. You can also set these exactly, but there's a benefit to using sort of these built-in settings, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, the other thing that we need here is we need to scale our, here we go. our legend to be an appropriate size. We'll maybe just make this a nice round number. Okay, so now that I have this scaled, now I'm going to copy my figure and go back into Keynote and just paste that in. And now it's exactly that box size. We're going to do another one. So let's now go to the area graph. And I want this image to be scaled the same as the last one. Do I need to redo everything I just did? No, I don't. So even across files, I can go to this file here, and I can go to my my canvas settings. I can actually even highlight my style settings, and I can copy these and then go into my other file. I have this graph selected, and I'm going to paste them. And now what I've just done is I have made sure that my font is the same and my size is the same. And I haven't had to redo that. Actually, I could have done the same with my axis settings, but then the titles would have changed. So I don't really want to do that. But I do want to change this to be the same spacing as the other graphic. So I want to make sure that this is also set to the Y space of narrow. There's a shortcut to doing that, to just right click or control click on the graph. You'll get access to Y space, and I can say narrow. I still need to set the width of my legend. I've done that to 110. Now this graph is all set. I can copy the figure, go back to Keynote, and then paste that in. And now you see how everything is really the same, lined up really nicely. My legends are lined up nicely. My graphs are lined up nicely. And in the example here, I did the same thing for, this one that's already done. I did the same thing for this last image here. Now this one had a different size, and again you can see what the sizes are, but I pre-did that all in DataGraph and then pasted that in to get this all lining up nice. And you can see how, because everything is scaled really nicely. This will line up nice. This line lined up nice, and it did all that automatically, just me pasting it in, because I had preset them up in DataGraph. All right, so the last thing that I really wanted to make sure that I talked about was using transparency. So this is my third rule, is to, maybe this is more of a guideline than a rule, but to know how to use transparency and to get things looking properly, I think is an important thing. So if we go back into DataGraph, and let's go actually to the multicolored line plots. Now this one is it's just scaling on its own right here. So let's just change it to specified. And again, if I'm doing this in Keynote, I can set this to actual size, and I'm going to set this to some pixel size. Now, one thing I guess I wanted to show you is this comparison that I did between these three tools. Here we go. Let me zoom up on this a bit, where each of these actually has a different native number of pixels, or the size of the slides themselves. There are ways, for example, Google Slides allows you to add more, but just by default, Keynote has the most pixels. It's 1920 by 1080 in terms of the width and the height. PowerPoint is a little bit less than that. It's 720, PowerPoint Online, and Google Slides is basically half of what Keynote is. These all have an aspect ratio of 16:9. Beamer, however, has a much smaller number of pixels for both the width and the height. It also has a 4:3 aspect ratio by default. You can change that. But what's sort of interesting again is or what I thought was sort of interesting to note how for these three, the first three, Keynote, PowerPoint, and Google Slides, this is where, again, if you made an image for printing, it's going to be way too small in terms of the font size and the images. But Beamer is actually set up so that you wouldn't necessarily need to scale things up like you do for the other three. Okay, so if I go back to my Keynote and, oh, actually, take that back. I wanted to go to the multicolored line plots. So now I'm going to scale this for Keynote, and I'll go ahead and specify this in terms of pixels. So again, I know Keynote, I'm going to want to have a big, a large size for that. So let's go ahead and do maybe 1200 by 1000, for example. And if you put that now to 50%, then you're going to see, again, this is what it would look like once I brought it into Keynote. I don't know, maybe 1000 is a little bit too tall. Let's go ahead and go down to 800. But by scaling it to a 50% or whatever Keynote is, it doesn't have to be 50%. You can change this scaling here as well. It's just if you go much above 50%, it's going to be, at least on my screen, it's going to be too big. But again, you're probably going to want to have about a 24-point font. I can make this bigger. And if I'm copying this and just pasting it into, and let me just Option drag, make a copy here, pasting this onto my slide. Now you see the sizing looks good. Maybe I want to move this down and add a title or something like that. But my image did come through as transparent. So it natively, if you just do copy figure and bring it in, it will be a transparent image. However, the font doesn't look right. I would not want to use this font. So if I go back into DataGraph and I change now my font into a white font and my pen into a white pen, now I can't see anything. That's not really very helpful. So what you can do is to go into your canvas settings and add a background color and go ahead and add a dark color to this. Now I can see better what this is going to look like. But the thing you want to pay attention to here is this export button. By default, when you add a background color, it will, oh, thank you so much for pointing that out. I see that I've made this mistake now twice, not zooming back out again. I hope I didn't do that for too long. Okay, now hopefully you can see I've gone into my canvas settings. I've changed my background color and I've added in something other than just white. But over to the right here, you'll see the export button. I should be zoomed back out now. Do you guys see? I'm still seeing, oh, you know what? There's maybe a little bit of a lag between your comments and me, so that's okay. I think at this point we should be good. So now when you have, excellent, thank you. Now when you have the color set to something darker, if you're just doing this so you can see within DataGraph, what is this going to look like when I use a background color that's in my slide, then you don't necessarily want to export this color with the graph itself, because if I leave this checked and now I copy my figure and I go here and I replace it, now you're still seeing the background. In fact, let me show you one thing that I did learn. If you double click on the image and then paste, it completely replaces the image instead of just adding another one on top of it. So in any case, this is not what I want, right? I it's great to see the background here, but I don't want to export it when I copy and paste. The other thing is that, again, the legend does have a background by default. I can just change that to nothing. And the other thing I might want to do is I might want to actually set this color to the same exact color as what I'm using my background slide for. I could do that with the color picker. I won't go ahead and do that now, but I'll just show you how if I copy the figure now and again, double click to replace, paste that in, now I have something that looks pretty good. So, anyway, so those are sort of my three things that I really wanted to cover today. The using the vector graphics, using consistent scaling, and then some tips on using transparencies appropriately. And now, once you have this transparent too, I can go ahead and, change, that would be kind of obnoxious, but I could change my color for the background and it is not going to, it's still going to look okay. It's going to be transparent. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. I'm definitely going to have to really watch myself on that zooming. So I'm sorry that I had it zoomed for a little while when I should not have. Is there anything that was missed or any other questions that anyone has? So one thing that I will comment on, because I did use, even though I didn't really have as much time as I thought I would to maybe go through each tool, but I did use each of these quite a bit this week. And one of the things to realize is that for both PowerPoint and Google Slides, you have the same ability to see what the pixels are for a given image and or see the sizing for an image, and also to set the zoom and the size. So those are the two things that I wanted to point out. So if you're in PowerPoint and you want to have the zoom in PowerPoint to be consistent with your zoom within DataGraph, so you can really preview what your image is going to look like when you bring it in, PowerPoint has the zooming down here in the right-hand side. So if you click on this button, it gives you an option of saying, what do you want to do? If you want to have the zoom set to 50%, there's also a slider here on the left-hand side where you can change the zoom level. But if you notice, if you have PowerPoint set to 50%, it's going to be much smaller than Keynote set to 50% because of what I said about the number of pixels you have being less in the PowerPoint web version. If I go over to Google Slides and I do the same thing, there's a zoom setting right here for my Google Slides. If I set that to 50%, you can see how that is even smaller than the PowerPoint and the Keynote. So I thought that was sort of interesting. I did not realize that these different tools would have different scaling factors like that. So question on the chat, do you have a preference for what presentation tool to use? I certainly use Keynote more than other tools. It's on the macOS system. It works nicely with DataGraph, and it does use vector graphics. But if a lot of people do collaborations on presentations, and in that case, you would be working online and would, maybe be using something like Google Slides. Now, Google Slides does have a way to change if you go into File, Page Setup, you can change the aspect ratio from widescreen to standard. Again, 4:3, this is what Beamer also uses. You can also do a custom size. And this was actually sort of interesting because one of the things that that you can do is you can, within DataGraph, you can set your files or your graphic size in inches. And you can see here, this has, 10 inches by 5.63 inches. And, you can do this for, if I go back, for example, to DataGraph, let me just show you this. So I could say, I want this to be 8 inches. You can also do centimeters or millimeters by 5 inches, something like that. Now, this is pretty small, right? Now I would probably want to scale my font a little bit less. Could scale this sizing up, but this is a sizing that would be more appropriate for something like Google Sheets. But what I did find is when I was bringing my images from DataGraph, exporting them, and then importing them into Google Sheets, this sizing was not correct, which sort of surprised me at first. And the reason seems to be that and actually I have this in this where I was doing this comparison. Let me show you the calculations I did here. Of course, doing everything in DataGraph. So the width and the height, these are again the pixel scaling at full size, if the zoom is 100%. And what I found was, that was actually sort of a surprise, that the points per inch for both PowerPoint and Google Slides was actually 96. Whereas we use 72. Again, when you're taking something from DataGraph into Keynote or Pages, which I do tend to use the Mac, the Mac ecosystem of tools, then if I have a graphic that I set to, for example, 5 inches by 3 inches or centimeters or whatever I set it to, then and I can say actual here. So now this, when I set it to actual, I can take a ruler on my screen and it's showing me exactly what this is going to print like. And it would also scale into my other programs appropriately. But to get this actually scaled in Google Sheets or PowerPoint to 5 inches by 3 inches, if you're working in units of measure, then the conversion factor we're using here of 72 is actually not going to work right. You would need to use the 96. And in fact, I'm how can I so just to show you like proof of concept here. This is a little bit in the weeds, but I don't know. I thought this was sort of interesting. If I do 5 by 72 and 3 by 72, so now I've changed my size here to a mathematical expression, which is fine. You can use variables in any of these. But I'm saying 5 times 72 or 3 times 72. It's set to actual. This one here, same graphic, 5 inches by 3 inches. Notice the size is not changing at all. It's exactly the right same size. And that's because inches in DataGraph is essentially a variable that is performing this calculation for you. Now you can, if you wanted to, make a variable called IN, and you can overwrite what we are using for that conversion factor. So if I now change the IN variable to be 96, now this would give me a 5 inches by 3 inches graphic that would match the sizing, or that would export as an appropriate size for Google and PowerPoint. And you can see it's a little bit bigger than the one that I have here. Again, I know not everyone necessarily needs to know that, but I thought that was kind of interesting and was sort of unexpected. Let me see if there's any other questions here. Yeah, I think when if there's a tool you're using, I think mostly just bringing exporting a file, checking the DPI, making sure that your image looks good. Again, that's the nice thing about using the vector graphics. You don't have to worry about that so much. If a file is generated in Keynote and then exported to PowerPoint, will it scale correctly, or is it better to create the presentation for each program? So that's one of the questions on the chat. That's a really interesting question. And I've done a lot of presentations in Keynote and then have had to create a PowerPoint version from that. In my experience, I haven't had a lot of trouble with that. If anyone else, wants to comment on the chat if they've found issues with it, that would be sort of interesting to note. But yeah, and I guess it's not like I've measured those images exactly to see, but I don't recall having issues with scaling going between a Keynote to a PowerPoint. I also actually take a lot of presentations and then make them as PDFs, as if I'm doing something online, that's kind of a convenient way to do things. And that's one thing that if you're doing something in Beamer, now Beamer is very different. I have files, some graphs here that I created. These are a combination of PNG, EPS, PDF. I tested all of these types of files, output from DataGraph. They all looked fine. You can see here, I added a background just to the inside of the graph, not the entire graph. I think sometimes that can be kind of a nice look. But with these, because these are all vector graphics, well, I guess I did test a PNG here, but you can scale the file using a text command that you're scaling it for a certain width of the available space on your slide. And then it's just going to be the right width for that slide. So you're not really working in pixels in the same way that you are for the other tools. So here's a question. Is there an easy way to set some of these options as default values in DataGraph? I'm thinking particularly for fonts, font sizes, and pen widths. Yeah, that's a good question. So, we've talked a lot about or it's been kind of an ongoing conversation that we've had about DataGraph with how to set up a custom set of basically a custom style setting. And we have talked about having a set of or the ability to have something in the preferences. But what I think we keep coming back to is the option that you have to create, go back to DataGraph, the option that you have to create your own templates. And do I even have any templates? I actually don't use templates that much, to be honest. But you, if you go into DataGraph, you go into the file menu, you'll go to From User Template. If you haven't created any yet, I think it brings you to the help page for how to create them. But basically, there's a folder in the Finder that if you place and this now moved to my other screen, if you place a DataGraph file here, it will become a template that you can use to drop data in and have that file. So that is one option, that you can set up a user template of your own that has the settings that you want for for fonts, and have a presentation template that you create. We haven't really created those ourselves for different presentation tools, for example. That would be maybe kind of an interesting thing to do. But you also can set a size menu here where you can see the on this gear menu, there's an add to size menu. So if, for example, if I knew this was a size that I wanted to keep, I could click that, add that to my size menu, and then you would see that there. So that's another option. And I guess the other thing, just again to make clear, that it's very easy to take these settings, edit, copy, go to another graph, and just paste those exact settings onto that graph, whether it's in the same file or a different file, so that you can really easily transfer these between graphs. And let's see, Beamer, someone was asking about the URL for Beamer. I'm actually using the, let's see, the overleaf.com is an online version of it. Then you don't have to necessarily install LaTeX completely on your computer. LaTeX is takes some setup to get working. So I think using Overleaf is a nice way to get started, and maybe just to work within Overleaf for doing LaTeX and doing Beamer applications. Inkscape, there's a comment about using Inkscape to make figures for publication. Good example to show how to export data graphs as vector graphics. It is then possible to change the fonts and colors in Inkscape. And that's, thank you for that comment. I know there's a number of people who use DataGraph to create the vector graphics that they bring into Inkscape and do further editing there. So I think if you Google Inkscape, you should be able to find that. Of course, we like you to stay in the DataGraph world, but for sure that is a very reasonable way to use DataGraph to create kind of the base graphs, bring them into Inkscape, and do further editing. One thing that we have found that might be just useful to comment in terms of when you're taking DataGraph vector graphics into other programs, the Adobe products have EPS as a file that is often requested. And I believe that for many journals, that EPS will be listed as a figure type that they're looking for. What we have found more recently is that the EPS files that we generate are not necessarily editable in Adobe products, that Adobe software can edit its own EPS files, but when the Apple system is creating, we're using that to create EPS files, those files have not always been editable. However, SVG is. So if you run into an issue with EPS, I highly recommend trying an SVG file format, also a vector format. And I had someone contact me at one point that had a journal that said they only accepted EPS. That wasn't working from DataGraph, so I suggested try SVG, and that turned out to work fine, and they did accept that. So anyway, that's sort of a bit of an aside. But and let me see if there's anything else. Okay. I think that's about it. Thanks so much, everyone. Very lively chat today. Really appreciate that. Hopefully that this was helpful for you. And one of the things I guess I did not get to that I was thinking I would, but I was starting to realize I had a lot of things to talk about and I wouldn't really get to today, is doing presentations directly from DataGraph. And I did show that a little bit last week. If you go into DataGraph, for example, you have this presentation mode. Now, I had actually almost forgotten about this, because we created for the pandemic, when everyone's on Zoom, we added this option for present in window, which gives you a presentation window that you can then share on Zoom. And I really, like this. Now, of course, it does not stay above. So it in some ways works best when you have two monitors, but I can go ahead here behind the scenes and change the file, change the image that's being shown. I can also go to different DataGraph files. It doesn't have to be within the same one. And then you can, share this. However, what we also have is, let me actually close this window, is view presentation mode. And this option is for when you have an external monitor or projector connected to your computer. So if you do, which I do right now, I can say present to this window. Now it's actually presenting to my other screen because of the one that I'm working on. So maybe what I can do just to kind of show you this a little bit better. Let me turn this off. Now although you can't see this, I'm bringing this to my second monitor that I'm using. I can say that I'm going to, let's see, view presentation mode. So now what you're seeing on the screen is a DataGraph presentation where I can, behind the scenes on my other monitor, go into even different DataGraph files and change, what you're seeing, and do all that again, kind of behind the scenes. So let me go ahead and escape out of that. Okay, so here we go. So anyway, so that is something worth trying, because when you're doing the DataGraph presentation mode, then it is, again, it's handling all the scaling for you. So whatever image you see, it's going to just expand that to your projector or your second monitor and do the scaling properly. So it's different than just, for example, DataGraph has this ability to separate the graph window. So you could, if you had a second monitor, you could separate the graph window, pull that to your second monitor, and view it there. But if you're using a projector that is making this image really, really big, that's not going to look good. It's going to scale badly. So the view presentation mode, this option here, will actually scale appropriately. So anyway, I thank you all, and we'll go ahead and break. I hope that everyone has a nice weekend. Here in North Carolina, we're bracing a little bit for some rain with Hurricane Ian, but hopefully won't get too bad here. Hopefully we don't. I know they're predicting a good bit of rain, but hopefully we won't have any flooding. And with that, I'll go ahead and sign off. Thanks so much.